I read Slade House by David Mitchell. This is Mitchell's seventh novel, and I've read the previous six books, and they're all kind of connected to each other. I'm going to be talking about those connections, so if you don't want spoilers for those books, then you should stop listening. Slade House is the shortest of David Mitchell's books so far, and is kind of a follow-up / sequel to The Bone Clocks. It's pretty much a horror story. It's the most genre-inflected story I think that Mitchell has created so far. It very much follows the conventions of a horror story. And just like the name implies, it's really about a place, or how a place kind of becomes a person in a way. And this place, of course, is haunted. And it's haunted by the twins named Nora and Jonah Gray. There's a lot of supernatural elements throughout Mitchell's books, but this book is probably the most explicitly supernatural in that these twins have figured out a way to not only become immortal in the way that we've seen various villainous characters in his books do, where they extract the soul energy of their victims and then use it to elongate their lives, but they've also figured out a way to freeze time for their bodies and their home personally, and then kind of astrally project their consciousness out of the body and the place and out into the world and possess other people. And so they live right alongside all of the other people in David Mitchell's universe and progress through time. But every 9 years, they're drawn back to the Slade House, where they have to lure in a victim that they feed on and use the psychic energy of to perpetuate this bubble of frozen time. And so that's like the larger backstory that is slowly revealed throughout the various parts. And there's a very familiar Mitchell structure here that starts in Ghostwritten and we see in Cloud Atlas and Bone Clocks, where we have a series of miniature stories that all interconnect and build on each other. And for me, this story almost has a fairy tale quality to it in terms of its repeating structure, and then the way that at the end, the repeating structure is inverted. So it's kind of like, the Three Little Pigs or something, where you've got the first two pigs kind of establish the pattern, and then the third pig inverts the pattern, and that gives us a kind of catharsis. It lets us know that the story is over. So the first story that establishes the pattern takes place in 1979, and just like in Cloud Atlas, each of the parts is going to move us forward through time. And you have a mother and son who have been lured into Slade House with the promise of work for the mother. And it's from the perspective of a little boy named Nathan, who is obviously autistic, although I guess in the 1970s, he wouldn't have been diagnosed that way. They wouldn't have known what to call it. He's been self-medicating with his mother's Valium. And there's a question when you read the book, like if you read this out of context without Mitchell's other books, you could believe that maybe he's having some kind of psychedelic side effects caused by the Valium, and that all the supernatural stuff maybe isn't totally real, and it would help you to kind of slowly sink into the supernatural, spooky horror story that's happening. Before Nathan and his mother go into the house, they're stuck in an alley where they have a hard time finding the entrance. This happens in all of the stories. And there's a kind of a choosing that has to happen of the narrator character to go into the haunted house. And so they are giving permission to the Grayers, kind of like they are offering themselves up as victims in a sense. This is you see this a lot in horror stories, that the protagonists or the people who die to the monstrous supernatural forces offer themselves up to the monster. Nathan sees the moon gray cat out in the alley, but the cat is dead, kind of signifying danger, or like this is a bad circumstance, right? Like the moon gray cat is a powerful symbol in Mitchell's work. Like I said before, when I talked about it in the 10,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, I don't totally know what the cat signifies, or if it even signifies the same thing in every story, but this seems like a bad omen when you find a dead cat out somewhere. Nathan's really worried about it, and it is one of those things that shows his preoccupation with details that don't bother other people, so he doesn't have a neurotypical chemistry to his mind. In any case, they go into the house, and Nathan's mother meets Nora, who is offering her a job, and then Nathan plays with a young version of Jonah, and they play a game called Fox and Hounds that I think ties into some of the themes that Mitchell often comes back to, of predator and prey. And of course, fox and hound has a connotation of hunting. So the hound in this case would be like hunting the fox, right? And what Nathan doesn't understand is he the hound or is he the fox? And we know that he's the victim in this case. And what seems to be his playmate is actually his murderer. Nathan seems to pass out of the Slade House, which has this amazing garden. It's this huge mansion. And right away we see that like it couldn't exist in this space as it's understood in the modern context of 1979. There's not enough room for this house to exist. The garden doesn't fit in with the landscape, and on and on. So there's just weirdness right away. But as the weirdness mounts, Nathan passes out. He loses consciousness. And when he comes to, he's in his father's house, who is in Rhodesia, which is part of the reason why his mother was looking for work, because his parents have gotten a divorce and she has sole custody of him, and she needs to be a provider. And she seems to have her own mental struggles with depression or mania. It's not totally clear, but she's the kind of person who is vulnerable to these psychic attacks. Like it seems like they target people who have psychic potential. And so probably a lot of her melancholia is related to some kind of latent, untrained powers that his mother might have. And maybe the same goes for Nathan himself. In any case, it seems like the Grayers consume both the mother and the son. But when Nathan wakes up in Rhodesia, he eats breakfast with his father and stepmother, and this is part of the cycle that's being established. So they have to find the gateway in the alley to get into the haunted grounds that don't fit the geometry of London. And then once they're in there, they have to consume some kind of food that helps to assimilate them somehow to the supernatural experience. And then once they do that, they're ushered to the attic space of the actual house itself, where a ceremony is conducted, and it has to do with a single flame on a candle, which, while it illuminates the space, doesn't move or radiate heat or anything. And so somehow it's been frozen in time. I think there's a moth that's nearing the flame, but it's been completely arrested in midair. So it just all signifies the frozenness of time in this place. And I talk a lot about how Mitchell plays with time. And even though we have a progression of time through the narrative here, we also have a regression of time where each of the characters are drawn back to the origin point of the immortality of these twins, and they're added upon in this space and time. And so there's a kind of, it's almost like a black hole or something, right? Like they're compacted into this space. And while their energy is used, it also seems like their consciousnesses persist to communicate with the next set of victims. And so they're not totally absorbed, and instead they become a part of the place. I think this goes back to the themes that I talked about in the Bone Clocks, where there's an idea that we don't exist as pure individuals necessarily, that our individuality is a piecemeal amalgamation of the other people in our lives that we know and care about, whether that caring is in the form of love or hatred. Like you're as defined by your enemies as you are by your allies, in other words. And so like the anchorites are not the anchorites without the horologists, and vice versa. And this kind of shows a backward kind of assembling of that amalgamation, where it reminds me of the cliched phrase, you are what you eat, right? Like these twins eat these people, they consume them to perpetuate their psychic immortality. But at the same time, those people are becoming a part of them, and they're not exactly happy to have been killed and sacrificed. And so they're rebellious. And so as they go along collecting victims, they are simultaneously building up the rebellion that's going to draw them down. So the second part of the book moves forward 9 years to 1988. And there's a detective who's looking into the disappearance of Nathan Bishop and his mother. His name is Gordon. His perspective is very kind of machismo. He thinks he's really awesome. He imagines himself to be like the star of detective narrative. He is a detective, but he's like not a very well-read guy. He has a tendency towards violence. He's just gotten out of a marriage relationship, and it seems like he was an abusive partner in that. He's easily lured into a sexual relationship with Nora, and this is how they get him into Slade House. But he sees her like in a very condescending way as like a clueless victim, and then somebody that he could exploit, that like by marrying her, he would become rich. And that of course she's entranced with him because he's so manly and cool. And so we go from the sympathetic character, I think, of Nathan, who is very vulnerable, and his perspective is kind of ironic because we as readers understand that he is not neurotypical, to another kind of ironic perspective in Gordon, where we can see that despite being a police officer and a detective, he's not a really great guy. But I think that it also shows that there are all kinds of people in Mitchell's universe, and that anybody can be victimized. And it takes the kind of moral imperative of the story out of it. So we're not just victimizing people who are like bad people, right? The Grayers are not like trying to clean up the streets by targeting serial killers or something. They're taking anybody who can serve their purposes, which makes them the more evil characters in the story, so to speak. As much as we don't like Gordon, we can understand that Jonah and Nora are worse. So in his investigation, Gordon finds the entrance to the alleyway. And again, he chooses to enter into the garden through the gateway because he sees an unlocked door, and it makes him angry at the property owner because he feels like, oh, somebody is going to break into this place, and then who's going to have to clean it up? Him, the police officer, is going to have to clean it up. And so he wants to have a word with the owner and tell them to get like a security system and be a more responsible property owner so the police don't have to like clean up everybody's mess. The point being that he chooses to go into the space, and then once he's in there, he meets Nora, who presents herself as Chloe, and we find out like it's basically an illusion. She's not really interacting with him with her physical body. The entire thing is a kind of psychotropic delusion that he's having. He seems to be like captured as soon as he enters the space, and everything is kind of happening in his mind. And like I said, they enter into a relationship. There's a dilation of time that happens with all of the characters. This happened with Nathan and his mother as well, where Gordon experiences a long-term relationship spanning over several weeks, or he thinks he does. This seems to be like kind of implanted memories maybe. But it speaks to like how the passage of time is weird in this place, right? Because like I said, they're being drawn backwards to the moment in time where everything was frozen for the twins in their body and in their home. But at the same time, everything is progressing forward in Gordon's mind, but it doesn't seem to be real. So like, is he experiencing a long period of time all in one day, or is he really captured here for months, but at the same time his body has been arrested so that he doesn't starve to death or anything like that? Like, it's unclear. It's like very spooky supernatural stuff is happening. It's supposed to feel very weird and confusing, I think. But the time dilation is something that happens to all of the characters, and it's difficult to gauge here because of the level of technology. But when we get to the next part, it's a little bit easier to see what's going on, I think. In any case, he is lured to the attic, and I forgot to mention this with Nathan as well, that on the trip to the attic, you see paintings of all of the previous victims in the whatever they're dressed in the moment that they go up to the attic. And so there's kind of a progression of time where you see some of the original victims, and then you move along, and then suddenly you're staring at a picture of yourself in the exact way that you're dressed, except that the characters don't have eyes, which is kind of erasing of identity and spirit and consciousness. And Gordon sees this same thing because like after he's had sex with Chloe, he dresses up in a robe and goes upstairs, and then he sees himself in the painting in the robe. And he also sees the past victims who he was there to find out what happened to them, to investigate their cold case. And he sees the paintings of them and realizes that he's fallen into some kind of trap. Then he's finally consumed by the twins, and each time that the twins take their victim, they have a conversation between them, and this is the way that we kind of learn about who they are and their backstory, their motivations, and all of that kind of thing. We're seeing them third hand, in other words. They're not the perspective characters, and we have to kind of try and puzzle out what's going on with these two. They don't exactly get along. Like Jonah seems to be more reckless and Nora is more conservative. She's really worried about this entire elaborate setup that they have where they have to draw in victims and how everything has to go like just perfectly or it's not going to work. But Jonah is extremely confident that they're smarter than all of the regular dopes out there, and they're going to always be able to manipulate people's desires in order to lure them into the trap and get them into a position where they can be consumed. Either way, the whole thing is successful once again, and the narrative jumps forward again another 9 years to 1997, and there's a group of students at a local college who have formed a paranormal club, I guess. I don't know what else to call it. It's kind of like they're super fans of the X-Files or something, and they want to kind of cosplay X-Files in real life. And this is from the perspective of a woman named Sally. She has a crush on the leader of the paranormal club, and it's also Halloween. And so the group of students, this club, goes out, they find the Slade House alley, they locate the gateway, and they enter in there. And instead of an empty haunted house like we've had in the previous 2 parts, there's like a huge house party that's happening with lots of other college students. And so that's a little bit surprising. And all of the interactions that happen kind of showcase Sally's vulnerability around her self-image. She feels that she's overweight and awkward, that she's not cool and confident like other girls. But at the same time, she has like deep romantic and sexual longings for a relationship, but especially for the leader of the paranormal club. Some of the students here include the sister of Johnny Penhanigan. Her name is Fern, which is the guy who drove his car off a cliff in the bone clocks. And she talks about that event and how it affected her, and how that drove her to join the paranormal club because she wants to believe that there's such a thing as an afterlife. And there was also stuff before this that directly linked into Cloud Atlas, where Nathan's mother was talking about the composer Vivian Ayres because she's a musician and loving his music, and that's a character from Cloud Atlas. And the leader of this group of paranormal superfans had something to do with Desiccated Embryos by Crispin Hershey, who's one of the primary narrators of the Bone Clocks. And so there's just all these little connections, just like the Moon Gray Cat, that draw into all of Mitchell's other works and give us the signal as his readers that, you know, this counts as part of understanding the world and tying into the larger themes of the kind of Uber story. I think it's important to set up those connections in terms of how the story ends. And I'm not sure that this story on its own just totally works without understanding who Marinus is when they come at the ending. I think I would find it abrupt if I had not read The Bone Clocks before this, but I don't know. I've given this book to other people and they really enjoyed it and hadn't read any of his other stuff. So like, what do I know? It seems like Mitchell created a really good story by using this structure, by repeating it in the kind of Three Little Pigs way that he does. And I guess I think of the Three Little Pigs because of the way that Sally is called a pig by her tormentors and bullies when she was a little girl, and she's forced to wear a Miss Piggy plastic mask, a Halloween mask for children, during this kind of nightmare episode of her being drawn into the house. I didn't mention that Gordon was fed dinner by Chloe, but that was when he ate some food, and Sally is fed some garlic bread, and she also eats some brownies. At various times, she kind of sees the way out of the house and the garden. She could choose to escape, but she chooses not to do that, even though things are getting weirder and weirder. And like at one point, while she's like going through all these different guests and stuff, she runs into Inspector Edmonds, the Gordon, the cop from the previous story, and he gives her a weapon. He tells her to fight back. And so, like I said, they're assembling victims, but they're also kind of, the Greyers are building a rebellion against the captivity and trap that they're building at the same time. And then Sally eventually goes up the stairs like everyone else, and she sees all the paintings. And she also has this amulet that her sister Freya gave to her. It's not totally clear to me if this has supernatural powers or if it's just a talisman for Sally herself. I think that you should probably read all of the victims to have latent psychic abilities, because that seems to be the reason that they are targeted by the twins and why they make useful victims. Their excess of psychic energy is used to fuel the house and the twins. So they can't just take regular people. It wouldn't be a big enough meal, in other words. And so I'm not sure if it's the amulet that she has or her own psychic powers, but she resists being drawn into the singularity of frozen time that everyone is drawn back to. And she challenges the twins, and it is like, someone will stop you one day. She offers up more resistance than the previous two victims had. And then moving forward 9 years, Sally's sister Freya has been trying to track down what happened to her ever since she vanished, and her other college friends also vanished all in the same night. And she has managed to get within the neighborhood of Slade House and the nearby pub that is the Fox and Hounds, so that, there's that motif again of the hunter and the hunted and predator and prey. And she's a journalist for Spyglass magazine, which has repeated throughout the books in various forms. And so she is kind of tracking down a story, perhaps, but really it's like her own personal kind of vendetta to find out what happened to her sister. She's interviewing a guy who he believes that he knows what happened. He is supposed to be the guy who talked to Nathan way back in the first story and kind of pointed out to them like, oh, Slade House is over there. And then he was hit by a car and put into a coma. And when he came out of the coma 9 years later, that's what sparked the investigation that had the detective go down there. And now he is kind of like a conspiracy theory guy who's put all the pieces together about what is this supernatural house that's destroying people in the neighborhood, and what's the backstory of the twins who lived there, and why are they doing this, and all of this stuff. And that's what the meat of the interview is about. It's laying out all of the supernatural backstory for both Freya and us as the readers. And so we find out that these twins were born a long time ago, and that they took possession of the house. They were like born in the 1800s. They took possession of the house in the 1930s before the World War II bombings in London. And they had been trained by some of the ancestors of Enomoto from the 10,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, how to distill souls so that you could use them to live forever. And they have a also relation to the anchorites ideologically. And so like they're being tied in with the larger mythological stuff that Mitchell has established in his other novels, basically. And then they were able to pull off some kind of psychic ritual that created a bubble of reality where time has stopped in the house, or at least in the attic, and where their bodies are around this candle, and then their consciousness can leave the bubble and go out into the world where time is moving normally. And during World War II, the house was bombed and everything is gone, and then it's all rebuilt, differently in the neighborhood. And that's why the house doesn't ever fit into the geometry, because it literally, doesn't exist there anymore. And they only make it exist when they open the pathway to it every 9 years. Freya has a hard time swallowing all of this, of course, because it's really crazy and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with her sister. But then the guy makes it link up and explains how, the twins are eating people's souls and how Sally was a victim. And then it turns out that the whole thing was actually, she was already in Slade House. She was never in this pub. The pub was just like another illusion, kind of like when Nathan went to Rhodesia, and that the entire night had a kind of time dilation effect again. So like when Sally is trying to figure out, what's going on as things get weirder and weirder during the Halloween party, she sees a news report that talks about how she went missing and all of her friends are missing. And there's a search on from the police. So it seems like she's been there for days and she's actually seeing a live broadcast. And while her sister Freya is doing this interview, she's getting constant text messages on her cell phone that from her partner who's asking like, where are you? When are you coming home? It's been days now. We're supposed to go to this wedding. Are you going to show up? Do you hate me? Things like that. And so it shows that while she's been like doing an interview for about an hour, what's actually been happening is that days and days and days are passing. And so time is slowing down for her as she's being drawn towards the core of this frozen moment. But time is still passing on the outside. And so it's like events are moving very, very quickly for her. There's, like I said, time dilation, weirdness. It seems like each time that they have to draw in a victim, the twins trade off. And so the first time around, it's Jonah who draws in Nathan, and then it's Nora who draws in the inspector, then it's Jonah who draws in Sally, and then it's Nora who draws in Freya. Or I guess that can't be right. I don't know. Maybe they don't trade off. Because in any event, Jonah is the one who seems to be in charge of Freya's whole thing. And in a kind of narcissistic, overconfident, typical way that he has been doing things, he has told her the truth about their entire backstory. And Freya used a recording device because she's a reporter to take the whole thing down. So now there's a recording of their entire history and the truth about them. And Nora's like really mad at Jonah about this. This is the real point. And so according to the structure, like before they consume their victim, the twins often argue about the methods used and, how effective the whole thing was. And Jonah's always overconfident and Nora's overcautious. And the same thing plays out once again. So she is drawn to the attic and all of that stuff happens and she's tricked into eating food and it just barely works. And then Jonah also, overplayed their hand by telling the truth about all of these very secret things that they're never supposed to reveal. But Jonah's like, who cares? Let's eat. Like it always works. It's always going to work. And then they split Freya's soul and they're getting ready to consume her just like they always do. And at that moment, her sister Sally appears and uses the hairpin weapon that was given to her by the detective and stabs Jonah in the neck, which is basically a fatal blow. But because time is frozen, he's going to die extremely slowly. It's going to take another 9 years for this wound to have an effect because the aperture of time only opens every 9 years. But the real effect is that the house is not given Freya's soul essence and the twins are not given the soul essence either. And Jonah is injured. And so just as Nora feared, the entire thing has kind of fallen apart and they don't have the energy that they need in order to create a new trap for another victim. And so just like with the Three Little Pigs, you have the whole thing of the wolf blowing the house down 2 times in a row. But now with the third thing, something has changed. And so in the structure here, we've had 3 people in a row who are kind of building incremental small changes as the story goes along. But now here's a big change, and the entire thing becomes inverted in the final part, which is actually from the perspective of Nora, who is usually the victimizer, but in this part of the story becomes the victim. And just like how they have tricked all of their victims, Nora is the one who's being played in this circumstance by Marinus. And so if we've read the other stories, we immediately recognize Marinus as a horologist, a powerful psychosoteric. And Marinus is kind of playing a dummy who's been lured into the whole thing and who is luckily an extremely powerful psychic. So it's going to kind of make up for the lost food from 9 years previous, because now we're in 2015. And so this is the version of Marinus who is in the bone clocks, and it all happens some 30 years before the second attack on the anchorites. And so this is just part of what horology does, right? They hunt down these soul vampires, these carnivores, people who predate on the normal, everyday people in the world to perpetuate their own lifespan. And what happened was Marinus ran across the recording that was made 9 years previous, where everything was revealed and all of the stuff about Enomoto. And he was like, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. And so it knows that this is a real thing that's related to the Shaded Way and the anchorites and all of that stuff. And so puts herself in a position where she can be, quote unquote, trapped. But really, she's the one who's doing the hunting. And so again, who's the fox? Who's the hound? So there's a real satisfaction, I think, that comes from the entire thing being turned inside out. It's really cool to see inside the mind of Nora, who's very worried about her brother. And just like we started the story with Nathan and his mother, and we also had Sally and Freya, who are sisters, who are siblings, and Freya coming to find out what happened to her sister. We have all of those kind of family dynamics and the vulnerability that's wrapped around them here with Nora, and the way that Nora tricked the inspector. Now she's being tricked and seduced by Marinus. And so all of the parts of the book are kind of like turned upside down on their head. And now the monster is being stalked by the monster hunter. Nora draws Marinus into Slade House through the gateway, but we see that everything is like falling apart. The garden is like colorless. It's wrapped in all this fog because they don't have the energy to render a full illusion that makes sense. Things are moving backwards in time in ways that they shouldn't. But the entire experience has been presented to Marinus through Nora as like, oh, here's a weird supernatural thing that like she calls herself an astronaut and is like, oh, all this paranormal stuff is actually real. And like, here's proof, and all of your patients that you've been seeing as a doctor that you thought were crazy and you were giving them antipsychotic drugs. Actually, they've been to places like this and you just never understood what's going on in the real world. And so that is supposed to like cover up why all the weirdness is happening. Marinus goes into the house willingly and then eventually goes up to the attic, but they can't get Marinus to eat any of the food. And so they kind of hiatus her consciousness and then put her into a hospital and pretend to be doctors and try to give her medicine. At which point Marinus reveals herself to be a horologist and their enemy. And then Jonah attacks her and is destroyed by Marinus easily. And this pops the bubble of frozen time, and time kind of pours into the house, destroying the attic because, it like catches up with the bombing of the place, but also it ages Nora's body. And we see in her perspective that her mind goes through senility and like her body breaks down, like all of her joints start hurting. She loses her hearing, her vision goes away as like 100-something years catches up with her. But Nora's able to kind of salvage her psychic power and transverse out of her body. And nearby, there's a pregnant woman, and she goes into the pregnant body and invades the baby that's there and takes up residence in its consciousness, displaces its consciousness, which is reminiscent of the Mongolian sojourner from Ghost Written. That's exactly how that story ends, where it takes up residence in a newborn baby, or a soon-to-be born baby, I think. But also follows the conventions of like a horror story, right? Because a lot of times in the horror story, even when the supernatural monster is overcome, you find out in the last moments of the story that, oh, nope, actually they survived and they're out there to hunt down the hero again. And there's a promise of a sequel, kind of a thing. The story will continue. The monster is never totally defeated. The evil is always out there. And so paranoia and anxiety are justified by the story. And in that same way, it seems that Nora like promises to get revenge on Marinus for destroying her brother and her home in exactly the same way that Freya went out there to get justice for her sister, and Sally defended her sister in those final moments. Nora is now going to try and find Horology and Marinus and hunt them down. But we're kind of left there in the narrative. We don't know what happens next with all of this, because this part of the story in the Uber novel, at least when this podcast is coming out, has no conclusion yet. We don't know what goes on with Marinus in the future because the story hasn't progressed out into that range. We know from Cloud Atlas, for example, that like we've seen deep into the post-apocalyptic future. We never met a Marinus there that we know of, and we never met a Nora that we know of either. And so maybe they do see each other again, and Nora is able to put an end to Marinus in some totalizing way. But there's kind of promise of a sequel, and like I said, I think it follows the conventions of a horror novel much more closely than anything else that Mitchell has written. So while the book fits into the larger story of the horologist and their war against the carnivores, at the same time, it makes a promise of retribution. And it plays with that idea of your enemy being a part of you, and the way that Nora is destroyed by her own victims. Now maybe that same logic can be applied to Marinus, that Marinus very self-confidently confronts these twins and doesn't take them super seriously. And maybe Marinus was right to do that because she does easily defeat the twins. But at the same time, since Nora is able to survive in some way, there's this new threat out there that Marinus created for herself, and maybe it's going to come back to bite her. And so by the logic of the novel's own construction, it creates a new threat in the Mitchell-verse for one of the biggest heroes, I guess, in the story. So it's a lot of fun. I really like this book. I love how much Mitchell is able to pack into such a short book. But it's a great little ghost story, and is even weirdly connected to the next book, which is another doorstopper called Utopia Avenue, and that'll be the last Mitchell book that I'll be covering before I move on to something else.